So hi everybody, thanks for joining us. My name is Ruth White. I'm with the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare, and I've been invited by the Institute to discuss housing options for youth aging out of foster care who struggle with disability. So I'll do a little overview, and essentially the goal of this presentation is to expose folks who tune in to a range of housing options that can suit the needs of young people with disabilities, but also to talk a little bit about the preparation that can happen before young people age out, well before they age out, to ensure that there's a seamless transition from the youth system to the adult system. And there are some challenges in various states, so I'll try and give you some information about where to find the laws of the state, the policies, and things of that nature, because a great deal of this is state specific. And then the very last slide that I'll share is contact information for the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare, so that if you need to reach out to us, you'll be able to contact us directly with questions about how to navigate this in your own state. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. This won't be news to many folks, but I feel that it's helpful to put this all in context. So, young people aging out of foster care, generally when young people reach the age of majority in foster care, they are posed with a number of hurdles, economic, educational, and otherwise. But of course, for young, so therefore a number of these young people are challenged with either mental health needs or often other kinds of physical health needs. And so these are just some statistics, pretty alarming statistics. 35 to 50% of young people have emotional or behavioral health problems, and anywhere from 20 to 60 have some kind of developmental disability or learning disability that they are struggling with, and about a quarter have chronic health conditions. But some of these things aren't going to readily translate into the adult mental health system, but we'll talk about that. So while I will talk about the ability to use the adult disability services system and the Social Security funding for young people aging out, I think it's important to point out that not all of these disabilities are recognized in the adult services world. So again, a lot of the onus is on us and the child welfare system to prepare young people and to create housing options for them that go beyond the scope of the adult disability portfolio. So, and again, to be on heightened alert for young people who are struggling with these kinds of issues while they're in the child welfare system is certainly important, because we can see with these statistics here that when you compare them to their peers who aren't struggling with disabilities, you can go down the stream. They're more likely to experience institutionalization, have more difficulty finding permanency, being reunified with their families. So their challenges are exacerbated as they struggle. But again, overall, young people aging out of foster care, sort of zeroing in on the issue that has brought you to this presentation, the issue of housing stability. Young people generally leaving foster care are about 12% likely to experience homelessness within a year of aging out, and then by the age of 22 to 23, we find that whether they aged out at 18 or 21, all young people aging out, when you take that group, about 25% of those young people experience homelessness. So housing seems to be a major challenge generally for young people aging out. So when you talk to advocates on the ground about this, it's really important that we acknowledge the fact that housing is going to be something that young people struggle with, and we anticipate that challenge and mitigate it by preparing young people as early as possible. So I want to put a plug in for the Juvenile Law Center, and actually, if folks have a chance, even while doing this webinar, taking a moment to go to this website, jlc.org. Right on the homepage, they have a link to a planning guide that they've prepared for communities to use. You can download it free of charge, that walks a case manager or an advocate or a guardian ad litem or a parent or foster parent for that matter. Anyone can easily use this guide to walk through the process of anticipating what services need to be in place while a young person is in care. And it's just a really straightforward guide. And you sort of start with looking at what the current placement is. Is it a family-like setting? Is it not a family-like setting? Will this young person, are they in a very structured setting where they're going to be more comfortable in a structured setting when they age out? What kind of funding is available to this young person? What kind of applications will need to be put in place when they age out? So it's a really great step-by-step guide. And again, it really covers the waterfront. And so some states would use this kind of a tool as early as age 13. So HHS requires now that service providers are beginning transition planning for young people that are likely to age out independently of family to age 14. So really need to be thinking about age 14. But I have on this slide a link to a program, the state of Florida requires that transition planning begin at age 13, that a career plan be adopted for all young people, and that for young people with disabilities, the federal government actually requires that school and employment transition planning begin at age 16. So in short, Florida's Children First is a nonprofit that works throughout the state to create a guide for this kind of planning, and I would encourage everyone who tunes in to pull down this document. And again, they provide it free of charge, so any state could go in and use this as a template to create a similar transition plan process for young people with disabilities in their state. And then moving back up a little bit, the Social Security Administration provides at this link information about every state and what their state guidelines are on the ability of states or case managers on the front lines to make application for Social Security funding or supplemental security funding prior to a child reaching the age of 18. In some states, we continue to have large gaps. I won't be able to go through that at length. And when I say gaps, I mean gaps in the time between a young person aging out and the time between the time that they are given information as to whether they're even approved for adult funding through Social Security. So states have gone to great lengths to reduce that gap. In some states, there is no gap. You can apply at 17 and a half and you get the funding at age 18. So these are really important bits of information that the Social Security Administration has put all in one place. So that's public funding. It's also important to figure out if a child is in care and their parents are paying child support, if they have severe disabilities, in many states, they're going to be required to continue to provide support for that young person even beyond the age of majority. So the National Council of State Legislators pulled together a list, again, it's a state-by-state grid of what the case law is and what the statutes are within the state regarding whether or not parents will be required to continue to provide support for their children upon age of majority or emancipation from foster care. So just because they're terminated from foster care at age 18 doesn't mean that that child support payment necessarily has to end. So I would encourage folks to visit this website and advocates and case managers alike to find out what the rights are of young people in terms of getting ongoing support from their parents. And I think many people will be shocked to see that most states do require parents to remain involved with the child, even if their parental rights have been terminated. And that support is available to those young people. The other important player here is that while I will discuss at length housing options for young people with disabilities, it's important to acknowledge that the Department of Labor does seek to create employment opportunities for young people, adults for that matter, with disabilities, and they do have an Office of Disability Employment Policy, and you can use this as a resource not only to plan for individual young people, but for your community, to make sure that your community has employers willing to bring these young people into the fold, and you know, take full advantage of that, the job coaching opportunities, to some extent the Good Samaritan opportunities. Some agencies have a priority in hiring for folks who struggle with disabilities. So these are all important facets of your housing plan because it makes a bit of a difference when folks can come into a relationship with a housing provider, whether that be nonprofit or for-profit, with the ability to make some contribution towards the rent. And furthermore, if you live in a community where you have a number of young people for whom you seek housing opportunities, getting residents to be able to pay a portion of the rent means that you can spread those subsidies farther, and you can serve more people if residents are making a contribution. So, so that's always we suggest that you bring housing providers together with employment providers and try to broker those deals. So what can child welfare entities do to ensure that there is a continuum of housing options available for young people? First of all, at the state level, and you see this more and more in planning for youth aging out, housing has to be a central feature of the independent living curriculum. It's really best if you can begin to get young people out into the community, renting their own properties. And again, with young people with disabilities, there are options that do give them an independent unit, but they're more in a building, so like permanent supportive housing arrangements, and I will talk a little bit about that. But suffice it to say, the acknowledgement that when a young person leaves foster care, they are going to have access to a safe, decent place to live. Really, it is a responsibility that child welfare has to take on in partnership with other entities throughout the state, so that all the way from the Governor's Office of Housing and Community Development, and on down the line to the mayor's offices and the housing money that they control. Really, young people with disabilities need to be considered eligible and a part of that conversation about how to distribute that housing money. But child welfare agencies need to do what they can to prepare young people through their independent living curriculum. And then we find that communities might be able to get housing units for young people who have a number of challenges, but occasionally these don't work out. And so young people might lose their placement, they might get evicted from an apartment, and on down the line. But child welfare needs to work with community providers to make sure that if things don't go well, that young adult in housing regardless, they might be 21 and still involved in child welfare, or they might be 26, that there is a community partner that can help move that individual back into, say, a group living setting, some kind of permanent supportive housing, host home. So in any event, we wouldn't ever want any kind of housing option if that went awry or that didn't work out for that to result in homelessness. So that's why we use the terminology of a bidirectional continuum. And the only way to really do this is to work, again, with statewide partners, public and private. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that and how to use those partners to free up funding for a range of options. So as young people with disabilities, and we use this same chart actually for all training that we do on affordable housing for young people leaving foster care, but this is perhaps ever even more important for this particular group because we don't want any gaps on this continuum. So any point at which a young person who is not going to be able to live independently without some kind of support, so a young person with like severe emotional struggles or severe mental illness or physical disabilities, ever to experience a gap. I remember hearing a really disturbing story from a well-known nonprofit here in D.C. that does serve young people throughout the D.C. metropolitan area, talking about how there was a gap between the time that a young person turned 18. Of course, this was prior to young people being able to stay till 21. But they would reach 18, these kids with severe mental illness in this area of the country, they would reach 18. They couldn't apply to the Social Security Administration or adult services until they were 18. And then it would take 6 months to a year for them to get processed and determined as eligible one way or another. So this facility, rather than putting these children on the street, which is where they would go, when they turned 18, they just allowed these young people to sort of hang around. And they would give them odd jobs. But they didn't put them on the street. But there was no funding stream. There was no future. These young people, and they were left in limbo for sometimes up to a year. And then if they were determined as ineligible, their future was just completely undetermined. And it was very disturbing. So we created this timeline to show we have to make sure that there are no gaps here and that we're knitting the funding streams together. So from the age of 13, 14, some forecasting needs to be done for these young people to determine, will they ever be independent? If this is not the case, then we need to be preparing all the documents for a Social Security application, all the documents to find out whether or not their parents are going to be able to, or are going to be, for lack of a better term, on the hook for child support. Is there a possibility that this young person will reach the end of the Title 40 stream at 21 and have no funding available, in which case there is an option called permanent supportive housing for them that, again, I'll talk to you about in detail. And the best way to free up a permanent supportive housing option, which I have down here under, let's see, I think I have a little arrow right here, permanent supportive housing, right here. The best way to get permanent supportive housing is for you to do forecasting here during the independent living phase. When a young person is, say, 16 to 18 years old, if you're aware that they're going to reach the end of the Title 40 line here, and they will not be, they might not have Social Security, they might not be able to work independently, their parents won't be on the hook. So essentially, they don't have any resources. If you know that back here when they're 18, you can give notice to your community permanent supportive housing provider. You could give them 6 to 7 years notice that you need a permanent supportive housing unit, and they can provide it. But again, I just really want to emphasize the partnership aspect of this and the forecasting that you could provide to community partners who provide permanent supportive housing. And essentially, permanent supportive housing can look different in different communities, but it is a permanent housing subsidy, often from the federal government, sometimes from private entities. But for folks who are in need of like ongoing on-site permanent, social services to keep them in their independent housing, there are buildings of, say, 10, 20 to 40 units where everyone is entitled to their own apartment. Maybe that's an efficiency, but they have all their own facilities within cooking, bathrooms, so on and so forth, within that building. But on the first floor of that building, there's access to 24-hour case management, folks to help you manage your money. Sometimes there's fiduciary agents on site that can help you manage, that can receive checks on your behalf. So, but to be able to give these entities 5 to 6 years notice that you'll need a unit would be key in freeing up a supported housing unit for folks. So we really just use this timeline to help demonstrate that. But this here, Title 4E, this age 18 to 21, in about half the states, communities can draw down federal funds to reimburse placements, and this is completely flexible dollars. So you could have a young person who was unable to live independent, but without supportive services. You could also use this Title 4E dollars to subsidize a placement in a permanent supportive housing building. So they're out in the community learning how to be a resident in a building, but they would have on-site services. So that is an option. In fact, let me get rid of my arrow. In terms of that part of the timeline I just showed from age 18 to 21, there's a great deal of flexibility in federal money now to serve young people and to get them out into the community so that they can, again, learn to live independently, learn to experience what it will be like when all of the child welfare system supports drop away, but with, so with access to that. So from 18 to 21, now that we have the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, we have a different way of using that federal money. There's a great deal of flexibility, and it is expected that communities use this time to prepare youth for housing. But if your state does not extend foster care past the age of 18, do not despair, because you can also use Chafee dollars. Every state has Chafee dollars, and you can also use that to subsidize rent. So in Illinois, for example, in some communities, Chafee dollars will cover rent. So rent is cheaper, than maybe not in Chicago, but maybe in Springfield. So we would encourage you that if you do have young people who are going to be independent in adulthood without family supports, that you consider taking this 18 to 21 period to give them an opportunity to try and live out in the community. Chafee money can also be used to subsidize units in permanent supportive housing buildings. So again, if you have a young person who is struggling with disabilities, you can use Chafee dollars to get them out into the community with support. This is just a little bit more about how the state of Illinois does this. Connecticut and California also use child welfare dollars to subsidize housing. And in the case of Connecticut, they are not reimbursed by the federal government because they have not adopted a Fostering Connections to Success Act state law. So they use their own dollars. They're not reimbursed by the federal government, but they do it because they know they save money doing it. It's actually cheaper to help young people with disabilities who are aging out live independently in housing than to have them in a residential treatment facility. So they do it because it's the right thing to do, but they also end up saving money. So I talked a little bit about how to use child welfare dollars. Our organization feels very strongly, and we feel that the research and the policy supports us on this, that you should look to your child welfare dollars to do as much housing as you can. But the reality is, when it comes to permanent housing beyond the age of 21, we're going to have to look to community partners. And so this is a list of various community partners and funding sources you can look to, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn. But I want to start with public housing authorities and talk really a little bit about a blueprint for housing child welfare relationships to support people who struggle with housing and independence, because not because everyone's going to necessarily get a partnership with a public housing authority, but because any housing entity you work with would fit nicely onto this chart. So the preeminent housing child welfare model is HUD's Family Unification Program, and it essentially works like this. Money comes in from the federal government to the local public housing authorities, and they have to sign an MOU with their Department of Children and Families. That's how the Family Unification Program works, but you could do this with a local permanent supportive housing provider. You could do this with a nonprofit, a private landlord. You know, if you're in a rural area, you might be doing this with a local church. And essentially, the MOUs between the two entities, institutions, but the young person is a big part of this because to some extent you want them to be able to choose from a continuum of options and learn that they have a responsibility here too. They have a responsibility to be a good tenant. In the case of young people with disabilities, there might be some medication management that's going to be required for them to have a good quality of life, and so on and so forth. So you might have to pull in this purple bubble here is your local supportive housing program. This could be any nonprofit. This could be a Crittenden agency, a community action program. Essentially, you're looking for a nonprofit that has some understanding of how the housing world works, how the world of low-income supportive services work, TANF, SNAP, Medicaid. You don't necessarily have to become an expert in that yourself to support a young person. The idea here is to get them knitted into the community with the provider you're comfortable with, so that when you step out, this young person with disabilities is a part of the community and has social capital that's knitted into the fabric of the community. So an important player here also is going to be the landlord. Now, this might be a private landlord, in which case you're going to hope that your supportive housing program folks have a cadre of landlords that are willing to, that they're building up these relationships with people who will take a risk on a young person with disabilities, that they understand that there might be challenges along the way. But a nonprofit player here also needs to be willing to step in to help. So this isn't going to be the case with every family that's in a program like this or every young person, but in the case of a young person who's struggling with emotional crises or, again, medication management, you're probably going to want a nonprofit in this relationship who can respond on a 24-hour basis, which is, again, why permanent supportive housing is often a good option. It turns out, again, that while that last chart may have seemed cumbersome or perhaps expensive, communities are moving in this direction because they find that it's cheaper. So I won't out the particular state, but I am aware of a state where they had a residential treatment facility in which they were serving children with psychiatric crises, and a one-year placement in this particular hospital was $850,000 per year. So it's cheaper. Now, this is a much more conservative cost-benefit analysis here, but it still demonstrates the point that it's about the tenth of the cost to serve these young people and serve them well, and also be sort of in line with what the research is saying. But it's, it's a tenth of the cost. These are just some examples of agencies that have done a really good job serving young people with housing. So Colorado not only creates units using HUD's Family Unification Program, but I think really the most important thing about this model here is that they have a relationship with the Mile High United Way, and through that they encourage self-sufficiency, but they offer an escrow account or an asset account where young people can contribute some savings along the way, and then they do financial literacy to help the young people kind of manage this account, and they then get kind of a nest egg for, for any emergencies they might experience along the way. Some of them have been able to invest this money. But for young people with disabilities, we're talking about perhaps, again, child support payments from their parents that need to be managed, Social Security, supplemental security income. There's a number of ways that these young people might be able to build some assets. Again, you don't want them to become perhaps over-income or have assets that are too high, but, just the idea that they get some financial literacy along the way. So any public housing authority can set a local preference for a population that's of interest to a community. So in partnering with your public housing authorities, it's really it's at the discretion of any public housing authority director. So we always say, take your public housing authority director to lunch. It's helpful if you can demonstrate the kinds of services that you can supplement the voucher or the housing unit with. And this is an example. The city of Las Vegas went ahead and set aside, I believe it ended up being a total of 50 Section 8 vouchers for young people experiencing homelessness who were tied to child welfare in that city. And this can happen in any public housing authority. And again, our organization is always available to help navigate that. So this is a particularly interesting example or player for this population because state housing finance agencies are different than a public housing authority. Essentially, a housing finance agency operates like a state bank. So they can generate revenue in a number of ways by issuing tax-exempt bonds. They administer low-income housing tax credits. So developers go to the housing finance agency to acquire funds to build, subsidize, and rehabilitate affordable housing and other kinds of construction projects within a state. But the important thing here is these folks could serve this population specifically. And a great example is the New Jersey Housing and Mortgage Finance Agency. About, let's say, 6 to 8 years ago, came to a presentation that we did specifically about young people with disabilities aging out of foster care. And the response of their staff was, we didn't know there were youth with disabilities aging out of foster care. We didn't even know there were young people aging out of, we had no idea this was going on. So because it was brought to their attention, they went back to the leadership in New Jersey, and they, within a year, were able to free up, generate revenue, free up the dollars, and begin construction on a building specifically to house young people aging out of foster care in New Jersey with disabilities in permanent housing. So these folks are an important player. A similar program is the HOME program. Unfortunately, Congress is always after this program, but in any event, HOME dollars can also be used to rehabilitate and subsidize housing. It's a little-known fact that the money can be used to subsidize rent. The state of Florida, under Governor Jeb Bush, again, at the time, Governor Bush was made aware of young people aging out of foster care, and the city just simply didn't know that this was going on. So once exposed to it, he used his discretion to set aside 5% of the state's home dollars to subsidize rent, and home dollars are very flexible. So this particular population would be perfect for home dollars. Earlier I mentioned the low-income housing tax credit. So just briefly, when buildings are constructed, any residential building in communities across the U.S., the real patchwork quilt of funding sources that are brought together by private developers to make the deals work. And so often there'll be a patch missing on that quilt. And the way developers make ends meet is by going after low-income housing tax credits. And essentially, they will have a reduction in their tax liabilities on a property if they agree to make the units affordable to low-income tenants. So a portion of the units affordable. So these properties, again, it's very flexible who they serve. The caveat here is often the units are made available to low-income tenants, but you do have to pay rent. And so extremely low-income tenants without a subsidy still can't afford to live in these properties. And by the way, these properties are beautiful and they're indistinguishable. They're mixed income. But what we recommend is that either you refer young people who are eligible for Title IV-E. Title IV-E could be used to pay this rent and make them eligible for these buildings, or supplemental security income, or again, if you have young people whose parents are still going to be liable for child support beyond the age of 18, you could use that child support to pay rent. And so finally, I mentioned New Jersey, Chicago, Colorado, Connecticut, California. There are some places that have made some major innovations in their ability to ensure that young people with disabilities never age out without a plan, and access to safe, decent housing, and that their continuum is not only bidirectional but seamless. And so I would suggest that if your community is sort of just beginning to put this continuum together, that you just simply go visit these folks or invite them to your community to help you, and we can put you in touch with those folks. There really isn't any community that I mentioned today that wants a young person's fate to be tied to geography. So they want to spread the wealth. This is not a situation where people are going to be asking for huge consulting fees to go in and help these continua be built. This is just simply the right thing to do. So I didn't really talk much about using homeless services dollars for this population, and I just want to really emphasize that is not because young people who are going to struggle to be independent when they reach adulthood. It's not because they're not eligible, and I think there is sort of a flawed narrative here in some continuum of care programs across the country which manage the federal homeless dollars, that youth aren't eligible. Kids coming out of foster care aren't eligible for either permanent supportive housing or shelter services or rapid rehousing. That is absolutely not the case. They are eligible. If you are turned away from your local continuum of care, we can help you navigate that. We can get you a seat at the table for your community continuum of care. But the reason that the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare doesn't dwell on homeless dollars is because often with these young people, we do know at age 13 or age 14 or age 16 that they have a disability, that they're not going to be independent as adults. You know, we have a great deal of time to forecast and reach out to community players to prevent them from becoming homeless. So they're not appropriate for shelters. They're not going to be appropriate certainly for a men's or a women's shelter. So, our organization would like to encourage folks to the extent that it's possible to avoid all of that, the whole homeless services continuum. Now, that said, I did mention several times the Permanent Supportive Housing Program that HUD funds, and these young people are eligible. It's appropriate. It would be great if you could send them into those units with some funding to support permanent supportive housing units. But more to come on that. So if folks are interested in more access to that, which does really fit under HUD's Continuum of Care program, please do reach out to our organization and we can help you. There might be some ways to do that with social innovation or pay for success programs, but I do want to encourage you to look beyond the homeless services dollars and to prepare these young people so homelessness is not an option for them. So with that, I'm going to give my contact information. The best place to go is probably email me or go to our website, nchcw.org. We're interested also in what our organization can do to support communities as they kind of sort all of this out. So please do reach out, and if you have any email, if you have any suggestions or anything for what we can do to better support people, please feel free to email me directly at rwhite@nchcw.org. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close. So thank you very much.